on the Middle East, where we discuss the big and interesting stories of the day. Today, I'll be talking about Fethullah Gulen, the Sunni Muslim preacher from eastern Turkey, who rose to become one of the most influential forces in the country for well over 3 decades, and the greatest enemy of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The pair were once allies. Gulen died this week at the age of 83 in self-imposed exile in the United States. His network of schools where Turkish girls and boys were fed a blend of science and Islam spanned the world. His army of disciples went on to rise in the bureaucracy and other key sectors in Turkey and in numerous other Islamic countries, giving Gulen outsized power. But he wielded that power for malign purposes. Gulen allegedly engineered the 2016 coup to violently overthrow Erdogan. The coup failed, but its results were devastating for Turkey's fragile democracy. With us here to discuss his legacy and the impact of his death is Selim Koru, a Turkish analyst who authors Kültürkampf, one of the best blogs on Turkey around. Welcome to our program again, Selim.
No, thank you for having me.
So something rather momentous has happened. I mean, we were all kind of expecting it, but Fethullah Gulen, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's number one enemy, bugbear, is dead.
Yes.
So what is the significance of this event? What will change in Turkey as a result of this man's death? And what would you say in general of his legacy?
Well, those are big questions, every single one of them. Well, I think his death brings about a measure of closure. Um, for example, he can't be extradited anymore, right? Um, every 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 conversation between a Turkish and U.S. official doesn't have that issue hanging over it anymore. He can't ever be tried, right? Because he's dead. So this is now an issue firmly in the past. And of course, this wasn't a regular person, right? He had an immense amount of charisma, uh, and that had an effect on people, on his followers, in a way that's probably very difficult for us to fathom, for for people who sort of were on the outside. It's very difficult to understand. But the people of the Gulen movement were fiercely devoted to him. It's especially at the height of their power, right? These people, these movements, um, it's never just religion. It's especially about power, about being on the inside, about what they called it the golden generation. The golden generation was the elite among the elite within the Gulen movement, who would sort of arise and rule Turkey and rule the Middle East, however you want to sort of read that text. But the idea was very much that this movement would come to dominate politics in the region in general.
Well, not just politics, every single aspect of life. I mean, I recall very vividly at the time that they were allowed to, sort of operate so freely in the early days of Erdogan, there was no aspect of society that was left untouched. You know, cinema, women's rights, Armenian-Turkish reconciliation. They wanted to have a finger in every single pie. It was quite extraordinary, the extent to which they felt they had to infiltrate every little tiny vessel of life.
Yeah. And I mean, even at the height of their power, the population of people we might call Gülenists wasn't all that high. It wasn't um, a big group. But as you said, they had this huge impact, and especially in the critical parts of society, in the important ministries, in the police, in all the universities, in all these institutions, and of course schools and cram schools and all these places, they had they had more than power. In many cases, they owned these institutions, right? To the extent that, Turkey is not a small country. It's now 85 million people. When they were in power, it was somewhere around 70 million. Pretty much everybody, I think, at some point or another, had a run-in with these people, and oftentimes it wasn't very pleasant. Oftentimes they were pretty judgy, and because this wasn't a movement of elites, they saw themselves as a group of chosen people. Um, a lot of times it was people who were passed over for a promotion, people who ran out of business who blamed the Gülenists for having run them out of business, or who were bought out, and things of that nature. So everybody has an opinion about especially if they live in sort of bigger cities
But how
where
much of this,
oh,
what we're just describing, is down to this single man who is no longer with us? I mean, it seems to me that he had near absolute control over this organization. I mean, what I've witnessed of it, it was very, very top down.
yeah, yeah. Well, yes and no, right? How much control can one man have? He certainly had as much as one man can have, I suppose. The political heart and I mean the way they talked about it, they talked about what they called the mahrem hizmet, right? The
Inner
so the movement
circle,
called yeah, the movement called itself the hizmet movement, right? Hizmet is
service movement.
literally service or servitude. It's a form of submission. And mahrem hizmet is sort of the secret service,
Yeah,
if you
the
will.
inner sanctum, that can only be penetrated by the select few.
Yeah, and those guys were kind of undercover a lot of times. Sometimes they weren't, but they were in like critical nodes of the system, right? And maybe those people can be considered mahremizmet as well. Maybe the term also evolved, I suppose. But th there were all these different groups within the system, and they had in the early days of the Erdogan-Gulen war, the Erdogan people called it the parallel state, because what the Gülenists would do is they would establish a parallel hierarchy wherever they found a hierarchy. So if in your neighborhood school, um, you just went to school, there's a a headmaster at the school, there's teachers and stuff, there's a hierarchy, right? But then there would be the imam of the school, the Gülenist imam, right? And that person would be, a junior teacher, for example. But that person would be running Gülenist business in that school, right? So that even the headmaster, for example, would respond to that junior teacher, would answer to that junior teacher. That was that was the whole idea. And that sort of network of imams ran across the country and across different sectors, and indeed across the world, because they have a lot of
Yeah, I
different
remember they had their Vietnam
parts of them.
imam, they had their Cambodia
Yeah, yeah.
imam, they had their, yeah, but I mean, again, I want to go back to the individual because he's died, and understanding his place in the movement helps us project, the future of it. I mean, it's taken a huge hit inside Turkey, obviously, but still it continues to operate in quite a few countries. They still have schools. They still have their businesses. And what does his death mean for that whole network? I mean, will it sort of fracture? Because there was a lot of obviously soul searching in the wake of the coup in particular, where many of them felt very deeply uncomfortable. Well, maybe I shouldn't say many because I don't know their exact numbers, but there was a fracturing of the movement. And will this sort of kind of lead to its full disintegration, or do you think it can survive his death? And if
Yeah,
so, what does that mean for Turkey, for example, for Erdogan, who is
right.
still hunting down these people inside Turkey?
I don't think the Gülenists are a major force anymore. I mean, the government certainly argues that it is. The government, obviously, the state and the state as governed by Erdogan has come out on top. They've won their war with the Gülenists very, very decisively. This was clear, I think, well before 2016 and the coup attempt. Um, but this is now abundantly clear, I think, and they've won not only by extracting Gülenist elements from all of Turkey's institutions, they've also won by sort of pursuing them across the world and then really breaking the back, the sort of spiritually breaking the back of the movement, really extinguishing any hope that they could ever come back, right? I think that's the most important thing here, that um, the movement probably, I mean, we can only speculate, but it's probably not growing, right? It's probably much poorer than it was, 5 years ago. It's probably worse off than it was a year ago, right? It's probably getting worse now for them, that they have less influence and only a handful of schools, even if they are across some continents. And I think that's because the sort of spiritual direction of the movement was um, was gone when it had to detach from Turkey after 2016, especially. Because I mean, to get back to the man, I mean, this was a man, as many people recently, many scholars of Turkey have pointed out, this was a man who was a product of the Cold War, right? He came up at a time when the sort of the struggle between the left and the right in Turkey was very fierce. And he came up in the Nurcu tradition. Um, the Nurcu were a sort of a sect of Islam, and they were, well, they followed the preachings of a man called Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, is the way he's often referred to, the best of his time. And this was a sort of autodidact, a Kurdish autodidact who um, was kind of interested in sort of an esoteric form of Islam. And what Gülen did was to take that and twist it, because Gülen was much more interested in power than the sort of the spiritual dimension. He was more interested in institutions in Turkey, and he was kind of a Turkish nationalist, a
Not
romantic.
kind of. He was super
Yeah,
Turkish,
yeah.
and he hated the peace process with the Kurds, for example.
Oh, yeah. He certainly did. Um, and the movement he built was very much from the get-go about state capture, capturing the institutions of the state, and in the long term, capturing the state, right? Building this parallel network
But I
across
mean,
Turkey.
seeing himself at its pinnacle, this man was a hugely, I mean, sort of egotistical sort of
Yeah,
guy, wasn't
but
he?
he knew what he was doing. I mean, it's this guy. He was also an autodidact, right? He didn't have a formal education, anything like that, but he read ferociously, and he didn't just read sort of Islamic texts, not at all. He'd read, sociology, he'd read all these other texts, and taught himself how to do this, how to influence people. And especially, I think we can get a better sense of his movement when we look at the sort of earlier years of his movement and its growth in the 70s, 80s. Um, by the 90s, they were already huge. But in the 70s and 80s, he had these gatherings where this was the kind of cult that where people would gather and they do really weird sort of chants. They would cry together,
I
right? They
shouldn't
would
laugh, but
like yeah, like he had these stories that he told people, these Quranic stories that he would embellish, right, about sacrifice and what it meant to love the Prophet, um, and
but it's almost like he thought of himself as a prophet, though,
yeah,
whoever
and the rule
suggested
about that,
that,
of
they'd be
course.
very offended.
Well, yeah, I mean, the rule about that was always to never say that, right? But yeah, it was in many ways a heretical movement, and many
I
Muslims would
like the
tell.
way you sort of have relegated very firmly into the past. I don't quite share your view on that. I still think they're, still they still are operational in many countries. And I won't name one of these countries, but I was in one of them recently, and they had shut down the schools just to please the Turkish government. But then they whispered in my ear, we sort of just relabeled the whole thing, but it's still pretty much the same school. And we just think that their education is so great. We just, couldn't forsake that. So
Yeah.
it made me wonder, that's probably happening elsewhere as well.
Well, yeah, I think so. But what I'm getting at is that this entire movement was everything about it was pointing towards state capture, about ruling Turkey
Yeah, I
by
guess in that
capturing its state.
sense, yeah.
And since that's gone, the empire, I mean, empires don't collapse entirely all of a sudden, right? They sort of they reach a high point, and then what happened in this case is that they reached their high point in the late 2000s, early 2010s, right? They overreached. They
Oh,
thought that,
clearly, the hubris was extraordinary.
right, it was incredible hubris. And they engaged in this war with Erdogan, and they thought they'd win, right? But they didn't. They
Oh
lost,
no,
right?
they
And
lost
it was a
spectacularly. Yeah.
a very brutal loss. So they still have this sort of global outreach. But I wouldn't call it an empire anymore. It's much more of a sort of the remnants of an empire, right? That
But
there is no
their
there's no
tactics are
purpose.
such, one can only wonder because there seems to be this mechanism whereby I don't know how it quite operates, but they take their cues from somewhere. So suddenly, these people who are living in exile now, part of the movement, all become Uber drivers. They all start embracing the human rights discourse. They all sort of try and blend in completely with the society. They kind of remind me of the Americans, that series where these Russian
Oh yeah. Yeah.
operatives were sort of embedding themselves into American society.
Mm.
They remind me of that quite a lot. And I wonder whether, they take the long view of everything, that they can't somehow stage some kind of a comeback. How can we be 100% sure that they're completely excised from Turkish society? I look at the number of people who, were their best friends who are still in government, who would happily go on their all expenses paid trips to, far-flung places that these people couldn't normally afford to go to. I just wonder, but I mean, I guess we need to keep focusing on the man himself and what his death means, in fact. And you said it's closure. Now, to me, closure means closure for Erdogan. It should be closure for him. So now that this big threat, this, menacing figure is gone, do you think that Erdogan will seize the opportunity to kind of turn the page and move on and maybe normalize a bit, reduce the tensions in society a bit, stop the witch hunts a bit? I mean, Hakan Fidan said the opposite. He said the fact that he's dead will not lead us to complacency. We're just going to keep up our battle against Gulen. But what do you foresee, or does in the end his death not matter very much, apart from the fact that his extradition won't come up in US Turkish conversations?
Well, Fidan did say that they'd maintain pressure on the organization, but he also, I think, as far as I remember, he implored people to uh, come out and sort of there was a outstretched hand, a sort of effort at reconciliation, I thought. I mean,
Really? Tell us more.
I don't think the government, and certainly not, Fidan or anybody else, would want to make peace with the Gülenist movement. But
No, no, but
they
what about
would
the rest of
encourage them.
society? Because the Gulen thing has served as cover to pursue, sundry perceived enemies. Even someone like me is accused of being a Gulenist, which is the most ridiculous thing on this planet, considering that they had gone after me as well, in writing. Uh, Lots of nasty articles about me for being critical of the stuff they were doing. So
Yeah.
I guess I'm speaking about something bigger than just,
No, I think what Fidan meant was
mhm.
that he wanted people to come out from the cold, to sort of confess and work with the state. And I think he had like important people in the Gülenist hierarchy in mind. It seemed like that was the kind of thing he was calling for. Um, and I think the assumption behind it was that this movement is dead anyways. That they would of course keep fighting whatever remnants of it are there. But that what I've been saying is the purpose behind the movement is now completely gone. It was already gone before 2016, I think. After 2016, it was very, very clear that it was gone. But now, again, like if these people had any kind of attachment to the charisma of, one man, now that they were kind of hoping this might give them an excuse to abandon that, come back to Turkey and talk to Fidan and anybody else and make a deal with them. That's what it seemed like he
Well, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to want to do that when you see Gulenists, quote unquote, still being, rendered from different countries. You just had that group rendered from Kenya, abducted basically.
yeah,
Um, and the Kenyan government obviously collaborating in this rendition, just
yeah,
transnational repression, it's called. So I wonder how much confidence people would have to respond positively to this call. That's another aspect where the retribution was way out of proportion, really, when you think about it. Um,
right.
and there's so much we still don't know about the coup attempt, though there is, I mean, very little doubt in my mind that the Gulenists were front and center
Yeah,
of that whole thing. But um, we shall see.
yeah,
The man had tremendous influence over Turkish politics for well over, what, 4 decades?
yeah, yeah. It's pretty wild that one man was able to sort of bring together all this. And of course, I think one has to realize that at least from 1999 on, he lived in the US and he did have all these international connections as well. He became an institution after a while. And the sort of liberalism of the time, the Cold War and post-Cold War environment were amenable to somebody like that, I think.
Well, there's always this theory out there that he was a CIA asset, that he was, keeping Turkey firmly on the side of the West, with through his anti-communist discourse, which was very pronounced,
Mhm.
and at the same time seemed, presented himself as pro-Israel. Well, pro-Israel perhaps is not the right term, but not adverse to Israel. You remember that, don't you?
Right, yeah.
That's how the Gulenists kind of presented themselves, as the moderate Islamists. But then when you saw them in action on the ground, for example, I recall going on a trip with them to Pakistan, and we were at the border at the line of control of the two Kashmirs, Indian and Pakistani Kashmir.
Mhm.
And it was extraordinary to me to see these Gulenists sort of egging on the Pakistanis, who were on the Pakistani side of the border, to chant these really anti-Indian, very Islamist sort of slogans. And I was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
this doesn't really make sense to me. You guys say you're moderates, and look at what you just did. And he said, we adapt to the circumstance. I thought, okay, that's great. And then another thing they said to me, one of these guys, was, Amberin Hanım, in 10 years, there'll be no Alevis left in Turkey. They were
Yeah.
convinced that they would somehow extinguish that too. So the hubris of it all, it's just quite extraordinary. And I guess, thank God that they're, if it, crushed, as you put it. Well, you didn't say crushed, but pretty much vanquished,
Yeah.
right?
They're done. Yeah.
They're
Yeah. I mean,
done.
that's really interesting. They were just at the base, I guess, regular Islamists, weren't they? They were, they had all of the classic right-wing Islamist reflexes that one might expect. Very anti-Alevi. They were very sort of they had that combative nature to them. It didn't come out straight away. They were this kind of reclusive priestly movement, right? They were sort of frail individuals when you looked at them, but they did have that combative, that nasty side to them.
Well,
Uh,
I met Fethullah Gulen because in the run-up
yeah.
to the big corruption scandal that they exposed in December 2013, which, basically highlighted massive corruption in the ranks of the government. They took groups of journalists to Gulen to meet with him, and you could feel they were trying to build sort of a consensus around what they were about to do and try and, engage with journalists and sort of pull them to their side, if you will. And it was a
Mhm.
most extraordinary experience meeting this guy and his false humility. He had this sort of big throne kind of thing, but was like made out of some fake leather. I don't know. I guess it was kind of very cushiony, comfy, so he felt comfortable in it, but it was quite massive. And he offered it to one of the members of our group, but you knew he knew that that guy would never accept it. The
Yeah.
whole thing was bizarre, and I felt distinctly that he was very misogynistic, that he didn't like women. And when we started talking about the peace process that was underway, then I could have been talking to a Turkish five-star general. The way he talked about the peace process, how dangerous it all was, and how, this was really not good for the country. But I'm just kind of rambling, I guess, right now, and how do we wrap this up, Selim? What do we conclude about the death of Fethullah Gulen?
His death does give people, I think, some form of closure. In the last couple of days since the news came, um, social media has been flooded with this, and all the mainstream TV stations have been talking about this. And what happens whenever the Gülenists come up is that people blame each other for having supported them at different points. Um, the CHP will blame the AK Party government for sort of taking them into government and empowering them as much as they did. And the AK Party will blame the CHP for sort of having kind of been on the same side with them after 2013. And there's lots of different micro levels of this, different people having different feuds about this. Um, so it is a kind of bitter chapter in Turkey, and people are still processing it, and people are still very, very bitter about it and blame each other about it. But do feel like it is a little more distant than it used to be. And Gülen's death will certainly, I think, help with that. And of course,
Well, of course, people do wish he had been brought back and been prosecuted, So in that sense, there isn't closure because there's still, as I said, so much that we don't know about how this coup was organized and all of that. But it's the ultimate irony, of course, that he would try to leverage the one institution that he fought tooth and nail to destroy, the Turkish military, to go after Erdogan. And what an ignominious ending. Not a great legacy, shall we say. Dearest Selim, thank you again for joining us today. It was great to have you on our program and looking forward to hosting you again.
Thanks, Amber.
And this brings us to the end of our podcast. For more in-depth coverage of the Middle East, please go to our website, www.al-monitor.com. Thanks for tuning in and goodbye.